Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I want to specifically thank John DeNuzzo for inviting me here. Also, Bruce Venter, longtime friend, gave me a good tour of Lake George today by his boat. My family brought me to Fort William Henry when I was 13 in 1975, and I haven't been back since, so it's quite a nice thing to be here. So let me bring my PowerPoint up. Whoop, let's go back one. So my program tonight is to talk about the Canadian invasion, 1775, 1776, and specifically what happens in Canada. A lot of that has to do with smallpox. So to understand the Canadian campaign, you have to know something about the origins of the Canadian campaign, and it starts with Fort Ticonderoga and Ethan Allen, May 10th, 1775. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold capture Fort Ticonderoga, and equally importantly, they raid Skenesboro, they seize Crown Point, and Benedict Arnold seizes temporarily this place in Canada called St. John's. And what they do is they seize several British warships, and they've opened the door to the invasion of Canada. But Congress doesn't really know if it wants to invade Canada or not. This is kind of interesting. Lexington and Concord are in April. Americans really aren't sure if independence is the final decision here, and we can sort of talk about that at some point. And throughout the summer of 1775, Congress debates what to do with Ticonderoga, what to do with Canada. There's some inclination that the French Canadians, who are new to the British Empire since 1763, might want to join them. There's also growing intelligence that Guy Carleton, governor of Canada, is assembling troops and warships at St. John's. And finally, in late June 1775, June 27th, Congress authorizes an invasion of Canada. And if you'd look here on my map, you can see there's going to be two wings. Richard Montgomery, actually Philip Schuyler, is going to lead the main invasion up Lake Champlain, the traditional invasion route, and Benedict Arnold is going to lead a second force through the Maine wilderness. And the whole idea here was for the Americans to hit the two major cities of Canada simultaneously. The belief was Carleton would defend Montreal and Quebec would fall without a fight to Arnold. And once Quebec was gone, Carleton would be in an untenable situation. And from my perspective here, the Montgomery phase is the forgotten phase. Everybody knows about Benedict Arnold, the march through the wilderness, and all sorts of things like this. Nobody really remembers the main invasion army in Canada is led by Richard Montgomery. And that's actually the one that achieves far more than Arnold, but nobody really remembers that, but maybe that's okay. So this is Richard Montgomery. Richard Montgomery is a former British officer. He was a captain in the British Army for 15 years, does not arrive in America until 1772. Spring of 1773, he marries into the wealthy Livingston family and is a very reluctant revolutionary. If you actually read Montgomery's writings, Montgomery hopes for reconciliation. He doesn't want independence. And when you read Montgomery's writings, the word he frequently uses to describe the Revolutionary War is melancholy. And he considers his closest friends in the world members of the British Army because he was a British soldier for 15 years. But he deeply believes in the American cause. He deeply believes that American liberty is being threatened. The Americans literally face slavery, that's his words, and he has an obligation to serve. So Montgomery's assignment was to advance up Lake Champlain and seize Montreal. And the places that are really protecting Montreal is this fort called St. John's. And you can see a sketch of St. John's on the left. You can see a sketch of the American siege of St. John's on the right. The sketch on the right is actually drawn by the British commander of St. John's, a man by the name of Preston, and Preston, okay? And the Americans under Richard Montgomery will lay siege to St. John's for about 48 days, from mid-September till November 3rd. And you get an idea what this siege was like. You can see at the top of the sketch, it says, thick, swampy wood, okay? It rains almost incessantly. Montgomery calls his army drowned rats crawling through the swamp. And Montgomery has a lot of problems. The American soldiers are green. They're not continental soldiers. Maybe technically they are, but they're from the militia tradition. They don't believe they should be given orders, they should be consulted. And then they can decide if they actually want to do this. Montgomery faces shortages of ammunition. At one point, he has to put his troops on half rations. But Philip Schuyler, who's ill, who actually should be leading the invasion, does a remarkably good job at providing Montgomery's army with a steady supply of food and gunpowder and cannonballs. And Montgomery's army, which ultimately will number about 2,000, maybe at some point he hits as high as maybe 2,400, will capture St. John's on November 3rd. The siege of St. John's lasts 48 days, probably the longest siege of the Revolutionary War, probably one of the longer sieges in American history, largely forgotten, but very significant because Montgomery captures over 600 soldiers at St. John's, including most of the British regulars in Canada. The other event that took place, and I should mention this very briefly, is if you would look just above St. John's, there's a place called Chambly. Chambly is another British outpost that's filled with about 6 tons of gunpowder. And Montgomery's men capture St. John's in mid-October, and the British don't destroy that gunpowder. And with that gunpowder, Montgomery is able to bombard St. John's into submission. Montgomery's men capture another 83 soldiers at Chambly, and if you put those together, you've largely destroyed the British 7th and 26th Regiments, the only British regiments in the St. Lawrence Valley. And with St. John's cleared, Montgomery moves on to Quebec, or on to Montreal. And a very vivid quote, it's early November, it's about November 5th, and Connecticut soldier Benjamin Trumbull, he's the son of the governor of Connecticut, writes, "Under our feet was snow and ice and water. Over our heads was cloud, snow, and rain. It was remarkable to see the Americans, after almost infinite fatigues and hardships, marching on at this advanced season, badly clothed and badly provided for to Montreal." They arrive at Montreal on November 11th. Guy Carleton evacuates the city, and the Americans enter the city on November 13th. Very important event, fall of Montreal. And if we would have a better map, all British outposts in the Great Lakes, like Detroit and Michilimackinac and Fort Niagara, are now cut off. And Montgomery has secured a very, very important victory. 6 days later, at the mouth of the Sorel River, Montgomery's troops seize 11 ships that are taking what's left of the British Army in Canada to Quebec, and Montgomery captures another 150 British soldiers. At this point, there are only 70 British regulars left in Canada. The Americans almost capture Guy Carleton. Carleton disguises himself as a French peasant and escapes in a canoe. Okay, so Montgomery is very, very close to running the board, and this is the highlight of the American success in Canada. And Montgomery will spend about the next 2 weeks reorganizing his army, also re-enlisting soldiers. And this whole idea of re-enlistment is fairly important. Lots of the American soldiers, their enlistments expire sometime in December or January 1st. You can see by this quote here, many of Montgomery's men, particularly there's a large contingent from Connecticut, don't believe they should be obligated to stay in Canada now that it's winter. And Montgomery ultimately gets the troops to go to Montreal by telling them that once Montreal falls, he will discharge anybody who wants to go home, and actually most of his army takes that option. Okay? So Montgomery spends about 2 weeks, reorganizes his army before he can push on to Quebec. Well, Benedict Arnold is on his way to Quebec City, and you can see on the map, Arnold will go up the Kennebec River to the Dead River to the Chaudière, and he's supposed to descend the Chaudière to a place called Point Levis, cross the St. Lawrence, and seize Quebec in this lightning strike that nobody sees coming. And kind of interestingly, the Americans have this map that was drawn by a British engineer in the 1750s or early 60s that says there's this route through the Maine wilderness. It's about 180 miles, and it will take about 20 days with a small, fast-moving force. And that's the plan. It'll take 20 days, And Guy Carleton won't even know they're coming because he's defending Montreal. Well, that doesn't quite work out that well. Instead, what we see happen is that it's somewhere close to about 300 miles, and it takes about 6 or 7 weeks. And they encounter horrific weather. They encounter a hurricane that raises the Dead River 8 feet overnight and washes away most of their equipment. And you can see this quote, "These poor devils are lost in the wilderness. This day went astray over mountain and through swamps which could scarcely be passed by wild animals. Waded a small river up to our waist, then marched on. At night we found ourselves within 5 miles of the place where we started from. We had marched 15 miles in vain. They begin to run out of food. They're eating their belt buckles. They eat some dogs with them. Men are eating squirrel tails. All right? And of Arnold's 70 men, or 1,100 men, only about 600 will actually make it to the south shore of the St. Lawrence River. About 400 in his rear guard, who have most of the provision, turn back. Some men starve to death. Some men are lost and never are seen again. And this is the epic that many people associate with the invasion of Canada. Many of Arnold's men leave accounts of this. He's considered the Hannibal of the American Revolution. People at that time are calling him Hannibal. Some compare him to Xenophon in the March of the 10,000 in the ancient world. And Arnold has all this publicity, but he actually doesn't really achieve anything. He crosses the St. Lawrence River, encounters Quebec City, and as his men are on the outskirts of Quebec City, they look like scarecrows. He's down to like 6 or 7 bullets per man. They see a British ship enter Quebec City, and what they don't know is it's Guy Carleton. Carleton has escaped, and Arnold does not have the strength to take Quebec City. He falls back and waits for Montgomery's forces to arrive. Montgomery and Arnold's forces meet about December 1st. On December 5th, they re-approach Quebec City, and they lay siege to Quebec City. And here's Quebec City. It's built on 2 levels. This is what's called Cape Diamond. And if you look on top, you can see the upper town. The upper town has the administrative buildings. The capital is there. And then the lower city is the commercial district. It's where the wharves are. It's where the warehouses are. And Montgomery, with about 900 soldiers, about 600 of Arnold's, about 300 New Yorkers he brought from Montreal, lay siege to Quebec City for about 3.5 weeks. But there's some problems, and you can kind of get a sense of this. It's winter. It's very, very cold winter. And Montgomery does not have the equipment for siege warfare, especially in winter. So he has artillery, but the artillery is so light the cannonballs bounce off the walls of Quebec. And there's actually accounts when the Americans open fire and the inhabitants of Quebec see the cannonballs bounce off. It gives them confidence. The Americans can't get into the city. Montgomery has his men build a siege battery out of ice. You can't dig, so they make these things out of wood called fascions and gabions, kind of like sandbags. They cover them with water and they freeze. And they use this ice battery to try to bombard the city. And the British destroy the ice battery with 32-pound cannonballs. All right, that didn't work. The Americans try sniper tactics. They shoot British sentries. And the British are horrified. You would shoot an unsuspecting individual. That's not gentlemanly. And it kind of looks good, but it doesn't bring Quebec to a surrender. Another problem here is Guy Carleton, the governor of Canada, knows that if he just holds up in the city, at some point reinforcements are going to arrive. He doesn't have to win. He has to not lose. So he's holed up in the city. And Montgomery and Arnold ultimately decide they've got to storm the city. On January 1st, 1776, Arnold's enlistments expire. 2/3 of the American army potentially are going to go home. So what Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold decide is on the first stormy night, they're going to storm Quebec City. Very interesting if you actually read Montgomery's writings. Even before he got to Quebec City, he suspected he was going to have to scale the city. He was going to have to take the city by assault. And the question is, how would you do it? And Montgomery has a couple of different plans. And the plan was, at least the initial one, was on December 27th, they were going to seize the upper town. And they were going to have a very complicated attack from several different points. There was a storm rising that would cover them. And at the last minute, the storm abated and Montgomery canceled the assault. That night, 2 or 3 American soldiers desert to Quebec City, and they give Guy Carleton the American assault plan. So Montgomery has to change his assault plan. And the new assault plan calls for a 4-pronged attack. There would be 2 diversions against the upper town. One at the very edge there, that's called Cape Diamond Bastion. One, there's a gate called St. Roch Gate. They were going to attack at St. Roch. And then the main attack was Richard Montgomery would lead his 300 New Yorkers from the left against the lower town. And Benedict Arnold would lead about 500 of his New Englanders against the right side of the lower town. And the belief was if they hit the lower town from both sides, they would seize it. What would happen after they captured the lower town, we don't quite know. Montgomery never wrote this down, but there's a couple of different theories. One is, once you were in the lower town, you could storm the upper town. There's actually a gate connecting the two. The other one that, in my mind, has a little bit more substance is they believed if the Americans could seize the commercial districts, they could seize the warehouses and the ships, the merchants of Quebec City probably could force Guy Carleton to surrender the city. Carleton only has like 70 regulars, and he has about 1,500 British and French Canadian militia of very dubious loyalty. And the theory is maybe if they had seized the lower town, the militia would desert and Quebec would fall. The attack is a disaster. The attack takes place on early morning, about 6 a.m., December 31st, in a howling blizzard. And it's a disaster. Richard Montgomery is killed almost immediately. That would be the image on the left. Very famous, very inaccurate vision of the death of Montgomery. If you actually look, the battle flags in the background are kind of like a cross. Montgomery's like a Jesus-like figure dying for the American cause. He's going to be deified, which is actually sort of part of my book. But Montgomery is literally leading his troops. He's literally the first guy through the gates. He's literally the first guy killed. Benedict Arnold's men actually fight their way into the lower city and achieve some success, but Arnold himself is very seriously wounded and has to leave the field. Daniel Morgan, famous Daniel Morgan, takes over and they stall in the lower town and they exchange gunfire with the British garrison of Quebec for about 4 or 5 hours. And they keep waiting for Montgomery's troops to attack from the other side. But after Montgomery is killed, Montgomery's command immediately retreated. And what happens is the French Canadians and the British Army slowly encircles Arnold's detachment. About mid-morning, early afternoon, Arnold's men surrender en masse, about 400 prisoners. And the American army in Canada has been shattered. Okay? The invasion of Canada fails. But we don't actually know all that yet. After the defeat, Arnold gamely maintains the siege. He's down to like maybe 400 men. He's got some French Canadians, and he sends frantic messages to Montreal, to Albany, to Philadelphia for troops. And Congress, Continental Congress, George Washington send troops to Canada as quickly as possible. But it's January, it's February. It's very difficult to move in the wintertime. You also have to organize these troops. And if you also think what's going on, the siege of Boston is going on at this point, and the Continental Army hasn't declared, the Continental Congress hasn't declared independence yet. There's many, many different facets here. But Congress makes a major commitment to try to seize Quebec City and hang on to what Montgomery has achieved, and Montgomery and Arnold, I guess I should say. And throughout February, in March, even into April 1776, thousands of Americans, elements of about 16 different regiments, are sent to Canada. It's a major commitment, but the American army in Canada is in very serious difficulty. One of the major problems is they don't have adequate provisions. And as their supplies begin to run out, they also begin to run out of money. They don't have money. Montgomery had some money with him. He borrows some money from some merchants in Montreal who support him, but it's not enough. Benedict Arnold actually has money with him, and it's lost in the Maine wilderness. So what the Americans end up doing is requisitioning supplies from the French-Canadian peasantry or giving basically IOUs. Not a great way to build rapport with the French Canadians. They don't like people taking their stuff and giving them paper. That had happened during the French and Indian. The French army would take food and things from them and give them pieces of paper that say, we'll pay you when the war's over. Well, they lost. Okay? The other issue is these reinforcements are arriving in Canada in increasingly large numbers. The first ones actually arrive in Montreal in February, but they don't have enough equipment. Sometimes they're lacking guns, sometimes they're lacking food, sometimes they have no money. And the different Americans in Canada say sending troops to Canada with no money, no food, really doesn't do any good, and it might even make things worse. The other thing is the French Canadians aren't stupid, and as the American position begins to erode, any support they have becomes much more conditional because it's very possible the French or the British are going to come back. But the final problem here, and this is kind of the main scope of our talk tonight, is smallpox. The first cases of smallpox appear in Montgomery's army in mid-December. And it's a very small outbreak, and they actually catch it and they quarantine these men. But then the army is defeated and Montgomery is killed. And what happens here is the smallpox epidemic starts to get worse. And I've got some statistics, kind of some interesting numbers here. On February 12th, Arnold writes a report where he says he has 800 men total, 250 of them are ill, and 50 of those ill have smallpox. Still a relatively small number. But as these reinforcements arrive in Canada, some of these men catch smallpox. The other issue is at this point, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this, there is knowledge of inoculation, but there's a question, should you inoculate soldiers who have, because once you inoculate someone, they're out of service for maybe 3 or 4 weeks. But if they get smallpox and die, they're out of service for a much longer time. There's also the question, should you inoculate? There's not a consensus if this is an effective measure. And some soldiers begin to inoculate themselves without telling their officers, which spread the disease even worse. And what happens is the smallpox epidemic begins to mushroom. I've got another statistic here. By May 1776, outside of Quebec, the Americans have 2,000 soldiers under arms. 1,200 of them are unfit for duty because of illness. And of those 1,200, the vast majority have smallpox. So 1,200 out of 2,000 have smallpox. That's a massive, massive outbreak. The American commander in Canada, the new American commander in Canada, is a man named John Thomas. John Thomas is a physician from Massachusetts. He was influential in the siege of Boston, and he was named as Montgomery's replacement after Montgomery is killed. Although he is a physician, Thomas does not believe in inoculation and forbids his soldiers to inoculate, but they continue to do so secretly. And Thomas himself will contract smallpox and die. Okay, so the Americans lose 2 commanders in Canada, one through action, one through smallpox. And what happens is the American position in Canada steadily erodes. And this erosion hits its peak on May 6, 1776. On May 6, 1776, actually on May 5th, the Americans see signal fires up the St. Lawrence. The Americans have stationed basically pickets up the St. Lawrence, and when British relief ships arrived, these men are supposed to light fires. And what the message is British reinforcements have arrived from Europe. And on May 6th, the vanguard of 12,000 British and German troops arrive in Quebec City. And by afternoon of May 6th, Guy Carleton sorties from Quebec City with 800 healthy men, and the American army almost begins to dissolve. Thomas, who's ill, he's not dead at this point, had already planned to retreat, but the arrival of British reinforcements turns the retreat into a rout. The Americans abandoned large amounts of their equipment. They abandoned most of their sick. Carleton captures hundreds and hundreds of sick Americans, paroles them all. Okay. The next day, May 7th, British warships destroy most of the American ships around Quebec, a couple of sloops, a couple of things called row galleys, and the American army starts this slow, painful retreat back to the mouth of the Sorel River, kind of close to where they started. And they arrive at Sorel somewhere around May 20th. At the same time this is happening, let me go back here, show you this map. You can see west of Montreal, there's a little bit of a place called the Cedars. And what happens at the Cedars is on May 19th, a group of British and Native Americans from the St. Lawrence Valley begin to approach Montreal. And at a place called the Cedars, they capture over 300 American prisoners, American soldiers. And there was a relief column. They ambush the relief column. They capture about another 150 American soldiers. And when Benedict Arnold in Montreal hears about this, he rushes troops to the Cedars. Nobody remembers the Cedars. There's a very good book about the Cedars by a man named Mark Anderson. When you read the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson makes reference to these savage Native Americans. He's referring to the Cedars. Kind of interesting. Thomas Jefferson is on the committee that's investigating the Cedars. At the same time, he's working on the Declaration. And some of the first drafts on the Declaration are actually written on the notes about the Cedars. And Arnold actually forces the British to release most of the American POWs in promise of future exchanges. And the Cedars is kind of this complicated affair. But the point is, it's a humiliating defeat for the Continental Army. 400 prisoners, almost no casualties on the other side. Cedars is a complete disaster. And at this point, Arnold begins to believe Canada is probably untenable. Some additional reinforcements are arriving in Canada, this massive wave Congress sent, and they've been told that there's actually, the Americans are led to believe, let's go back one more map, that at the city of Three Rivers, or Trois Rivières, Guy Carleton has sent a small advance force of 300 men, and the Americans decide if they could attack these 300 men, they could kind of restore their position in Canada. Many of these reinforcements are from Pennsylvania, some of probably maybe the people who were just recently reinterred here. And the Americans launched this counterattack at Three Rivers, or Trois Rivières, on June 7th. The Americans get lost in a swamp. Instead of attacking Three Rivers in a surprise assault, they wander in a swamp for about 7 hours. And when they emerge from the swamp, they don't find 300 British soldiers. They find 2,000 entrenched back by the Royal Navy. And the American army takes another humiliating defeat at Three Rivers. The Americans suffer over 400 casualties, including 236 prisoners, including their commander, a Pennsylvanian named William Thompson. And with the defeat at the Cedars, with the defeat at Three Rivers, with a smallpox epidemic ravaging the army, the Americans decide they have to leave Canada. And the Americans start a long, slow, ugly retreat from Canada. Benedict Arnold writes, kind of my favorite quote here. He says, "I am heartily chagrined to think we have lost in 1 month all the immortal Montgomery was a whole campaign in gaining, together with our credit and many men and an amazing sum of money. The Americans have lost everything." And the Americans retreat back to St. John's and Chambly, where they had started back in September. The British are rapidly pursuing. Guy Carleton, with about 12,000 British troops, makes a joint maneuver against both Montreal and the American army on the Sorel River. They're trying to trap the Americans in Canada. And ultimately, the Americans decide to evacuate Canada and return to Ticonderoga and Crown Point. Benedict Arnold, very famously, is the last American to leave. He pushes his bateau into the river. He and his aides shoot their horses so the British don't get their horses. And the American army proceeds to Île-en-Noix. Now, I have to apologize. This picture is actually a field hospital from the Civil War. But there are no photos of Île-en-Noix. But Île-en-Noix is this place about 12 miles south of St. John's where the American army retreats to, and the army is just ripe with smallpox. And there's a doctor named Louis Baby, and you can see his quote here. He says, "No mortal will ever believe what these soldiers suffered unless they're eyewitnesses." Horrible, horrible accounts. Hundreds and hundreds of American soldiers die of smallpox on Île-en-Noix. There's accounts that these men have maggots coming out of their nose and stuff. Horrible stuff. I've read accounts people have smallpox pustules on their eyeballs. Horrible, horrible stuff. And the American army immediately begins a long, painful retreat to Crown Point. They start this on June 19th. They keep rowing back and forth in the sun. And the last American units leave Île-en-Noix and return to Crown Point on July 2nd. Kind of interesting, 2 days before the Declaration of Independence is adopted. The same day Congress actually declares independence, but nobody really remembers that. So by July 2nd, 1776, the American invasion of Canada is over, and the Americans are largely back from where they started. So on that note, I will close it here. I will pass the microphone off to Sam, and he will talk about Crown Point.
Oh, yeah, sure. That'd be great, yeah, thank you.
Sure.
So, I also wanted just to thank John and the Lake George Battlefield Alliance for having me here. My job is to get us from Crown Point to Fort George and kind of what happens next. Just get my presentation up here. So as Dr. Gabriel just described, the retreat to Crown Point is sort of this measured retreat coming down the lake. They arrive at Crown Point on somewhere between July 1st and July 2nd, with the last of them arriving on July 2nd. That's the first letter that we have from the commanding officer who had sort of stepped in after General John Thomas had passed away of smallpox, is John Sullivan. So General John Sullivan is leading this measured retreat down the lake towards Crown Point, and his first letter from Crown Point is on July 2nd, 1776, just shortly after arriving. He writes to George Washington saying, "I am now about fortifying this post, which I think may, in a short time, be made strong enough to baffle all the attempts of our enemies." This is, Sullivan arrives, Crown Point is as far back as we want to pull, so he begins the process of what he thinks is going to be the next spot to hold off Carleton and those 12,000 troops that'll be coming down the lake in a certain amount of time. Sullivan had his work cut out for him. The British fort at Crown Point, which had been built beginning in 1759, had burned in an accidental fire in 1773. So this is a graphic rendering of what that fire looked like. There was a soldier's wife in one of the barracks buildings cooking a midday meal of pork and peas. It caught the chimney on fire, it spread to the roof tiles, it spread to the walls of the fort, then it spread to the powder magazine. A woman making lunch burns down one of the largest fortifications in North America, 2 years before the American Revolution even begins. So when Sullivan arrived in Crown Point, he probably saw something very similar to what Crown Point looks like today. These are the ruins of the two large stone barracks buildings that were at Crown Point. They were described by people who arrived in July of 1776 as being burned out. As far as the main body of the fort itself, this looks a little bit what it probably looked like, big piles of dirt. After the fire in, did I have that? No, I don't. After the fire in 1773, we had a quote here before, a British engineer called it a useless pile of earth, essentially. So this is what Sullivan looks around and says, yeah, let's take our shot here. Crown Point was really in no very good condition to begin refortifying, but the spot itself was a notoriously strong position on Lake Champlain. It's very narrow on Lake Champlain on the southern end until you really get to Crown Point, and the lake sort of opens up to the north. So it was been a fortified post starting in the 1730s, and there's good reason to think John Sullivan was serious about making this the spot to make a stand. But they were still dealing with this issue of a large number of infected troops. And the first orders, or some of the first orders that are issued when the Army arrives at Crown Point, are to separate the sick from the well soldiers, and they sent them over to what's called Chimney Point, the point opposite Crown Point on what's now the Vermont side of the lake. The other thing that he ordered, among other things, is to make sure that all the entrenching tools that were with all the regiments are inside the barracks or inside the walls of the fort. That would be inside these mounds of dirt to begin refortifying the posts. This is, again, just as they arrive on July 2nd, 1776. Here's a nice aerial view of what the two peninsulas look like. It's a very narrow gap. That's why the French fortified, why the British fortified, and eventually why they put the bridge there at this particular spot. But the condition of the Army was a source of concern, not just to General John Sullivan, but to his commanding officers as well, and to other people who were witnesses to what was going on at Crown Point. John Trumbull, the son of a Connecticut governor, later a very famous painter, visited in July, and he described the scene at Crown Point as not an army, but a mob. The shattered remains of 12 or 15 very fine battalions, ruined by sickness, fatigue, and desertions, and void of every idea of discipline or subordination. Last spring, the Army was upwards of 10,000 strong. We now have 3,000 sick and about the same number well. Around the same time, there was an account written by a soldier who had been at the Cedars and had come down from Canada, and he described after being there about 8 days that they were burying on average anywhere from 15 to 20 people a day at Crown Point during this sort of pause moment in the retreat from down Lake Champlain. All of this sort of situation at Crown Point develops into a moment where people have to make a pretty significant real-time command decision. John Sullivan had essentially taken over command of the Army in Canada during the retreat, but he'd actually been passed over to be the leader of that group of soldiers. That honor was given to Horatio Gates, and Horatio Gates hadn't yet arrived at Crown Point and come up with the Army. He was on his way. So was Philip Schuyler, who was the Major General, same rank as Horatio Gates, who was in charge of what was called the Northern Department, which is basically everything up until the Canadian border. Horatio Gates was appointed the commander of the Army in Canada. When the Army was no longer in Canada and now in northern New York, there's a little bit of a dispute between Gates and Schuyler as to who's actually in charge. Schuyler controls the Northern Department, and the Army that Gates is in charge of is now in that department. So both of them have a little bit of a discussion about who actually is in charge of this. They're sending off letters to Congress and sending letters off to George Washington, say, can you clear this up? My command is earlier than his. I have an older command, but he's in charge of the Army. How do you want this essentially to work? How it does work is everybody convenes at Crown Point to decide what to do next. Sullivan's beginning entrenching and separating the sick. The rest of the commanding officers will be called up to Crown Point and arrive there and hold a council of war at Crown Point on July 7th, 1776. This is a council of war of the general officers, and it's 5 different generals. So we have Benedict Arnold on the far left, Horatio Gates in the middle, General John Sullivan, Philip Schuyler on the bottom right, and a 5th officer who's actually a Prussian general or an officer who's volunteered for the American Revolution, named Baron de Woedke. This is the part of the story where 5 guys go into a tent, and they come out with a series of decisions on what's going to happen next with this failed invasion of Canada, this sick army. Where are we going to dig in? What do we do next? The Council of War is recorded. The resolutions are recorded. They send a letter to George Washington. This is the original text. I don't expect you to read it. But this is the copy that's in the Library of Congress and George Washington's papers. What it actually said is they made 4 resolutions. I'm not going to read these word for word, but I'll highlight the key points. The first resolution was that Crown Point was not a tenable location for a defense in the summer of 1776. The second was the next option was to move further south on the lake and defend what they called the strong ground opposite Ticonderoga. That's an area that is a similar peninsula shape to Ticonderoga, but it basically has a large bluff or a cliff face that looks north. They would eventually pull down the lake to that location in the summer of 1776. When the American Army there learned of the Declaration of Independence, it was renamed and became Mount Independence, which is a state historic site in Vermont today. In that same resolution, they made the decision to remove all the sick infected much further away than the opposite side of the lake and pulled them all the way down to Fort George. So it's this Council of War that establishes the smallpox hospital at Fort George, at least in name and through this resolution. This also establishes the need to, or acknowledges the need to build ships and boats and put them on the lake. This would become the fleet that Benedict Arnold is overseeing the construction of at Skeensboro, that would later go up the lake to Valcour Island. And there's a fourth resolution to basically begin mapping out a road from Skeensboro to points south and connect different settlements. So it's this Council of War, as I said, that establishes not just the hospital at Fort George, but the next decision, really the battle plan or the process for the remainder of 1776. I have a little bit of time that I wanted to just go on there's a little bit more to the story. This was not a particularly popular decision. Particularly among New England officers who had just retreated from Canada. There's some Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, even some New Jersey field officers. So these are colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, who immediately after hearing about the Council of War's resolutions write a 7-point remonstrance. And they address it to Philip Schuyler and explain all the reasons why the Council of War's position was the wrong one. In 18th century language, there's a lot of room to be delicate when you're criticizing your commanding officer, but that's what they were doing. And I haven't written all 7 out, but I've summarized them. Essentially what they say is that Crown Point is a better location, it is a tenable position, and they're confident that this is the place to dig in, not only for naval superiority on the lake, but also as a better post. And one of the points that they make in these 7 points of their remonstrance, these field officers are kind of anxious about withdrawing to Ticonderoga, which they considered an unhealthy place. This sort of fear of smallpox and going to a place where the water's not as good, where there are histories of sickness, they're reluctant to pull further down the lake, to give up ground and go to a place that may not be the healthiest. The other reason, and this seems particularly true of the New England officers, is this would open up the east side of Lake Champlain, which is essentially the west end of New England, to attacks from this advancing British Army. There are settlements in Vermont. There are settlements on the northern part of Lake Champlain. This cedes all of that to British control, is what they're saying in this remonstrance. The final one is giving up Crown Point, which again was considered a strong spot of ground and an important post, would cede it to the British. If Carleton comes down the summer of 1776 or even the fall of 1776, there's no reason to think that he won't stop, refortify Crown Point, and create a 12-mile no man's land between Ticonderoga and Crown Point. So these are the concerns that these field officers raise. Philip Schuyler writes back to them very quickly, thank you for what you think, and very kind of coldly says, I have other reasons, they're better, and thank you, but the decision's been made. The story doesn't really end there because all of these letters going back and forth after the Council of War make their rounds. So you have people like John Hancock chiming in on this Council of War, who says the retreat, this is to George Washington. Hancock, of course, is president of the Continental Congress, and says the retreat from Crown Point seems to be considered in opposite views by the general and field officers. The former, meaning the general officers, those 5 guys in the tent, I am satisfied have weighed the matter well, and yet the reasons assigned by the latter against it appear strong and forcible. This is really the way to write. I hope whatever is done will be for the best. This is the President of Congress saying to the commander of the armed forces, I hope you know what you're doing, and you've got a lot of dissension in the ranks, and we really don't know how this is all going to turn out. Washington himself is a little unnerved by the decision to withdraw from Crown Point. He writes to Schuyler. Again, I'm not going to read all of this, but There's a long preamble of it's not appropriate for these field officers to do what they did. We don't want to give them too much credit. We do not want to agree with them. But I kind of agree with them about halfway through is what essentially he's saying. I've ever understood Crown Point to be an important post from its situation of the utmost consequence to us, especially if we mean to keep the superiority and mastery of the lake. If it is abandoned by us, it is natural to suppose the enemy will possess it. This is word for word pretty much out of the field officer's remonstrance. Schuyler's decision, and the Council of War resolutions don't actually reach Washington or anybody else for quite some time. The Army was already moving at that point. So essentially Washington is, he didn't command Schuyler to change his decision, but really wanted to be sure that this was the right one. Philip Schuyler writes many, many letters explaining the decision, and ultimately the choice that he makes and the defense that he makes is a pretty good one, all things considered. Crown Point would have been a very difficult post to rebuild, but just as importantly, there was deep concern among those general officers that the east side of the lake, the Vermont side of the lake, which had been improved, which meant there were people there and towns and roads, made it very, very easy for Carleton's army, or would have made it easier for Carleton's army to land an army, his British forces north of Crown Point, move them across land and cut off any access and supply routes to Crown Point. So ultimately, this is one of those moments that, yes, it creates the conditions for the hospital at Fort George. It creates the decision to dig in at Ticonderoga. This is Fort Ticonderoga again, and a map of the fortifications they would build there. All of those things were what happened, but there is this moment at the Crown Point Council of War where there's a deep sense of uncertainty. The Canadian campaign was never supposed to fail. Everyone sort of expected it to be successful. And this withdrawal down the lake is sort of caught up in this moment at the Council of War, the field officer's remonstrance, and one of those command decisions that at the time they weren't really 100% sure who was right or what the exact move to make would be. But that essentially carries us through the withdrawal from Crown Point. The Americans would pull back down to Mount Independence. As I said, that was renamed that in the summer of 1776. They renamed part of the Ticonderoga Peninsula Liberty Hill, and this would be where they would make their stand against Carleton if and when he would come down the lake. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Richard Leach, who's going to take us through the Smallpox Hospital here.
All right, I think we've got it. So good evening, everybody. I'm very glad you're here. I'm very glad to be here. I think this is terrific stuff. As you've heard, I'm a clinician, so I'm going to talk to you a considerable amount about smallpox, the disease. But smallpox, the disease, and you've heard a little bit about its workings in the campaign into Canada, I think is a considerably underestimated factor in the early revolutionary times. I think that the campaign in Canada, the failure of it, and the role of smallpox needs to be better understood. And so, John Denuzzo, thank you, wherever you are, so much for putting this together. I think this is a really terrific event, and I'm happy to be presenting along with my esteemed colleagues. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about smallpox, as I say, the speckled monster. Before I get into smallpox, let me just make this acknowledgement. Where we are congregated this evening, of course, was the land of the Mohawk, the gatekeepers to the Adirondack. They were called part of the Iroquois Consortium. And this allows me to tell you a little teeny bit about smallpox at the very beginning. There was no smallpox in the New World. It was an old world disease. And it was only when the conquistadors and then the colonials came in that they brought a bunch of diseases, but most famously, and certainly far and away the majority of the illness was caused by smallpox that almost wiped out the Native Americans. Maybe as many as 90% of the population of Native Americans in North and South America were killed principally by smallpox, not by the rifle or the sword. So with that, let me show you a little bit of an outline of where I want to go. We'll talk a little bit about the disease itself in history, and including in the colonies and the early Revolutionary War and how frightening it was. And then we'll talk some about the Fort George, the place to die or to live if you barely could, and then the ramifications of the understanding of the failure of the Canadian campaign and the role of smallpox that went into the Continental Congress's consciousness, and especially George Washington's consciousness, and then the very important decision that was the first public health mandate in the history of the United States, when George Washington ordered his troops to be variolated. Remember that term, I'll explain it to you in a minute. And that was maybe a turning point in the Revolutionary War. Okay, the speckled monster. There, of course, is a close-up of, I don't know if I can get you, of the rash. Later on, that's going to disintegrate, those, and then the heads will come off. They'll turn into pustular forms and look totally disgusting. We're going to give you a teeny small history of the smallpox in the world. First of all, you have to understand that this is a viral disease, and the virus is called variola. It wasn't called that then because they didn't know about viruses, of course. That's our current phrase for it. It probably came into, oh, by the way, it's a large virus. It's probably the largest virus that can infect animals. That's the size of it in comparison to COVID-19. So you see that COVID-19 is about a fourth the size. And that allows me to make a brief tangent. When smallpox was the only vaccination that we gave 100 years ago, now we give, a myriad, of vaccines to kids up to 18, a total of 30 shots by the time they're 18. If you clumped the junk that we put into a person's arm with smallpox and compared that to the entirety of the junk that we put into kids through those 30 shots, there was much more what we call antigenic material in the smallpox. And that's just worthwhile thinking about, because when I'm going to tell you about vaccination, which cured smallpox and eradicated it from the human race, it was done by vaccination, and that vaccine was a wicked vaccine in comparison to our current vaccines with more antigenic material. It's just worthwhile thinking about that in relationship to some of the politics that's going on now. We don't know exactly when it came into the human race, but presumably a long time ago. This is a picture of a child that is an Egyptian mummy about 3,000 years ago, and there's evidence of smallpox on the face of this youngster. But probably the smallpox actually came into the human race as long ago as 11,000 years ago, when we first started to smooch with animals, agriculture and farming. And it probably came over from a wild bovine of some sort, not quite looking like that. And a curiosity of the smallpox, the variola virus, is that when it came over, it decided never to go back to animals. So it was strictly a viral infection of people. And that actually, and I won't detail this for you, was a very important piece of the ultimate campaign to eradicate smallpox, because we didn't have to go to an animal population to eradicate it. We'll never get rid of Ebola, because Ebola is in the animal population. We can't go in and clean out all the animals. So we're going to be continually bombarded by Ebola, but we got rid of smallpox. It was, I briefly mentioned, an old world disease, and that's an important piece to remember, but let's go on to it being highly, highly contagious. By respiratory droplets. I'll tell you more about the progress of the disease in a bit, but among the first places that the rash starts to populate the integument is actually in the mouth, pharynx, and respiratory tract. So Active viral particles are all through the mucous membranes. You cough, you sneeze, and that's what you do when you cough or sneeze. You shower out, 6 or 8 feet out there, your germs. And in smallpox's case, you're showering out smallpox. But it's also contact dependent. That is to say, rash is in the pustules of the skin, and plenty of opportunity for viruses to go to somebody's hand, to go to their mouth, and boom, they've been infected that way too. And of course, by the way, when smallpox comes in contact with a cozy blanket, then that blanket is infected, and that blanket can be used as a bioweapon. We haven't got time to discuss those things, but that's really fun stuff to get back into. Well, it was a seriously awful disease. It was extremely painful, and I'll detail that in a little bit later, but it was totally terrifying. And, well, it should have been, because it caused a 30% mortality in the old world. That is to say, 3 out of 10 people who got it died. So you get smallpox, you face that kind of statistic at the very start. But finally, it's preventable through variolation and vaccination. Now let me look with you at, and that's a hurrah. Let me look now with you just extremely briefly about smallpox in the history of infectious diseases. This is a cartoon of the 7 deadliest plagues, and it has its distinct limitations, but it gives you some sort of sense. The size of the circles represents the number of millions of people dead in whatever epidemic it is. And the largest one you can see there is the Black Plague in the 1300s. This Augustan plague here, and this and that plague, wait a minute, sorry, this circle right here, the third plague, are probably all the same thing. They're probably all Pasteurella pestis. The Black Plague was caused by that. It's a bacterial disease, not a viral disease. I'm not going to go into that. But it caused these major outbreaks, terrifying outbreaks, and it looks to then be that the Black Plague is the worst of the plagues of humankind. But that's really not true, because this cartoon doesn't capture the impact of smallpox, because smallpox started 11,000 years ago, and it killed people, sputtering around like this and that, 1 or 2 or 4 at a time, not in huge epidemics. It had an endemic pattern, as we call it. And so it killed gazillions of people that are uncountable over time. And yes, it would make small epidemics when people clustered together, because when clustered together, people get sick and then, pass the germ around much more easily. You all know that. Before we leave this, it's worthwhile just noticing that that's the 1918 influenza epidemic, one hell of a bad one, and us infectious disease folks are still concerned that influenza may come back and do something like that. The farthest one down there is COVID-19. Anyway, I think that we can probably say that smallpox is really the very worst of the human maladies, both in terms of numbers of people killed and certainly how terrible a disease it is. And we've forgotten how terrible a disease it is because we did eradicate it. 3 generations have passed since we actually snuffed out the last case, which was in Ethiopia in 1977. And we have snuffed it out by vaccination. And again, I reiterate that, especially in relationship to what's going on in politics in the current day and age. Let's talk about variolation before vaccination. What is variolation? And this is the thing that was used in the campaign in Canada that you've already heard about, sometimes irresponsibly, and we'll talk a little bit about that. What is variolation? Well, we don't know where it began, but maybe as early as the 1100s or 1200s, either China or India. It was recorded in the 15th century in Asia, so we know it was at least operative then. Somebody, maybe one, maybe several, came up with some observations that were so important. First of all, they understood that if you get smallpox and survive it, you never get it again, no matter if you're several times exposed. So in our current parlance, you become immune, long-term immunity. Like measles. You get measles, you never get it again. You get smallpox, you never get it again if you survive them. Now, it's also true that they must have observed that the lighter cases were less mortal. That is to say, you get a heavy case, you die. Well, it's pretty obvious. But they began to intuit, golly, if we could only control it, if we could only give people a small case of smallpox, they would be much more likely to survive it, and then they would become long-term immune in our parlance. And that is where variolation began. How did they start it? Well, what they did was they used a lancet like that, or a scalpel. They made a puncture into the skin, either here in the hand or up in the shoulder like that, and they introduced pus from a goopy rash from somebody who had smallpox and smeared it into the wound. Here you can see that it starts here as a small thing, sort of gets more inflamed, and then it may have these sort of satellite pustules, and even more so. It can get really bad. If a person's already, their immune system is already sunk, maybe they're starving, for example, and they haven't got good immunity, it may be that this procedure won't cause a localized thing. It may disseminate and get terrible, and it may kill people. And it did kill people, but much more of the time it did not kill people, and indeed they did go on to become immune. The important piece here is that this was controlled smallpox. It was smallpox, controlled smallpox. Sometimes it went wild, sometimes it killed people, and it was always contagious. And that's an important point when you start to think about what people were doing in the campaign in Canada. They were variolating themselves, and they were not quarantining themselves when they did that. So they were spreading the smallpox from their wounds to their comrades beside them. A brief look at the mortality rates. So as I've said, the mortality rate for smallpox, that is the wild type, that is passed from individual to individual through respiratory droplets, about 30%. By the way, about 90% for the Native Americans, more about that in a bit. And only 3% from variolation, so 3 versus 30, no brainer. When we get to vaccination, it's 0%. That's also a no-brainer. All right, so variolation took hold in Asia, and then it started to spread into Europe and into Africa. And then it got into the UK or Great Britain and came across the pond and arrived in Boston in 1721, when there was an active epidemic of smallpox actually going on. Cotton Mather. You may remember that name. You may remember that not particularly fondly. He was a judge in the Salem witch trial responsible for putting a lot of people to death. Not his best chapter in life. He then went on to become a fairly revered clergyman in Boston, and he had quite a congregation, and it was a wealthy congregation, and they gave him a slave. And that slave was called Onesimus. Onesimus, it turned out, was royalty in probably from Ghana region. And he spoke English pretty well. He was a very intelligent man, and he had been variolated because of his prestigious position. He came to be the slave of Mather. Mather was talking to him about smallpox, discovered that he had actually had the procedure, and he was immune. And Mather got very excited. He began to enlist comrades. One of them was Dr. Zebdiel Boylston. Maybe those of you who have been to Boston know Boylston Street, and Benjamin Franklin and the Adamses. And slowly variolation took hold in Boston and then in other colonies. By the way, I won't dwell on this in any degree, at the same time that variolation was taking hold, anti-variolation was taking hold. You know, history rhymes, right? And the reasons that were given that variolation was damnable was because, yes, there were adverse effects, including severe disease and death, that people were causing, as opposed to God's will. If you get smallpox and die, it's God's will. If you've been variolated and you die, it's a person's will. And so there was mistrust of doctors and scientists in that regard. Enough of that. What's the difference between variolation and vaccination? Variolation is called after the virus variola. Vaccination is called after the virus vaccinia. Vaccinia is a cowpox. Vacca is the Latin word for cow. And they're extremely similar viruses. I won't tell you the story of Edward Jenner, who invented vaccination, but basically he invented it because he realized that milkmaids who were getting cowpox through the cracks in their hands as they milked the cows never got smallpox. And so then he invented that procedure that we now call vaccination. Same method. You make a wound, you smear the stuff in there. Same benefit, long-term immunity. But much safer is vaccination than is variolation. Variolation had that 3% mortality rate. Vaccination has 0. Variolation was smallpox, capable of being spread. Vaccination is not and can't be spread. Here is a brief look at what happened in the 20th century from 1920 on, with a very intense campaign to spread vaccination through the entire world. And we did, in fact, eradicate smallpox entirely. The last case was in 1977, and that was that boy in Ethiopia. And he not only was the last case, but he also survived another fireworks. Before we leave this slide, it's worthwhile mentioning that in the 20th century, 300 to 500 million people died with smallpox. Now, if you put that in that cartoon of those nasties, those 7 nastiest plagues, it would actually be the Black Plague. Okay? Pretty impressive to think about that. Of course, there were a gazillion fewer people back in the 1300s than there were in the 20th century, so that needs to be calculated in the denominator. Now let's look briefly at smallpox in the colonies as that happened. Of course, as we've already mentioned, it was brought in by the conquistadors and the colonialists. Here's something worthwhile understanding. In the old world, smallpox being as contagious as it was, it hit virtually everybody. It went from here to there and killed this one, that one, and mostly at a very young age. And if you survived, you'd always have pock marks on your face. That was a characteristic of the disease. By the way, milkmaids had clear complexions, which is part of the reason that Edward Jenner understood, wow, light bulb. And by the way, that's also the reason that there are an awful lot of dirty jokes about farmers' daughters, the object of lust, because they had clear complexions. Well, the endemic pattern in the old world, as we've talked about. In the new world, as boatloads of new arrivals would come into the coastal cities, they brought with them smallpox and there'd be outbreaks. And especially, of course, in the Native Americans who were so poorly protected, they had no exposure to smallpox in their past history, and therefore they were extremely susceptible and would die quickly. By the way, that's why there were no American Indian native slaves. They couldn't be relied upon as slaves, so we had to import them from Africa. Makes sense. What about the colonialists in 1775? There were about 2,500,000 of us at that point. Here's an important point. They were spread out. There were, in fact, conglomerations of them in those cities, as you can see, but far and away the majority of the people were spread out, and therefore they were not being exposed to the epidemics of the cities. It's worthwhile just actually noticing that Fort Edward probably had 750 people, and Glens Falls area was, I guess we declared ourselves Wings Falls in about 1765 or something like that. So only 10 years old, and there were about 20 to 25 Quaker families here in those days. A brief look at the concepts of medicine, just to give you a sense of how incredibly different our consciousnesses are about it. Smallpox was actually thought to be an imbalance of the four humors. The four humors, that was a concept of the Greeks way back when: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. And there was normally a balance of these things, and if things got out of whack, a disease would come. And it depended on what got out of whack where or how, a different disease was manifest. And this is, in smallpox's case, principally caused by miasma, bad air, malaria. Malaria was another one of the miasmic diseases, and for better reason than for smallpoxes, because of course mosquitoes in swamps, malaria, good idea, but that wasn't so with smallpox. Concepts of hygiene and microbes had not, of course, arrived. That would arrive maybe 75 years later. Quarantine had been invented, and I don't understand exactly how it was invented, but it was invented during the time of the Black Plague in the 1300s. Quarantine meaning separating the sick from the well, which becomes, of course, the case in Fort George. And finally, it's worthwhile pointing out something that almost nobody knows, and that is that there was the concept of contagion invented by an apparently brilliant physician in Italy named Fracastoro. And in the 1500s, he said, wow, people are passing things to each other. And he thought they were seeds that were proliferating, that somehow were passed invisibly. And he was right, in the 1500s. Amazing. Well, what about the practice of medicine? In those days, of course, there were very few permanent hospitals. In fact, there were two. One of them was New York City, one of them was in Philadelphia. The one in New York City became Columbia. The one in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, became the University of Pennsylvania. Worthwhile knowing that. Other hospitals had to be put up on a temporary basis, of course, especially in relationship to wars. These were field hospitals. And Fort George was an example of that, perhaps the grandest, you might say, of the temporary field hospitals. There were very, very few trained physicians. Some of them were trained in what became Columbia and the University of Pennsylvania, those two hospitals. Most of them went to Great Britain to be trained, but there were very few of them. And yes, there were apprentices of those quote, trained physicians, and so there were more physicians than just were really trained. Medicine was mostly actually delivered by women. No surprise to the women in this room. There were useful medicines, but most medicines weren't. The two useful medicines in the sense of smallpox were narcotics, and specifically laudanum, which was a tincture, an alcoholic tincture of opium, and it killed pain, and it actually really worked pretty well. Then fever was a major part of smallpox, and they tried to make the fevers come down with willow bark and cinchona bark, which are salicylates like aspirin. They use a bunch of other stuff that I won't go into at all, but just to mention briefly in passing that bleeding and purging was what killed George Washington. And then, of course, there's lots of surgery, amputations, and the like. Brief look at Fort George. I've spent a lot of time here on smallpox because I think it's important for you to understand how terrible this disease is, and as an actor in this Revolutionary War scenario. But you all know this anyway. There is where the hospital was. Where are we? We're somewhere up in here. And the remnants of Fort George are over there, and the hospital was probably laid out between Fort George and the shore. We don't actually really know exactly where it was because it didn't have any foundations. And there have been some digs, including by David Starbuck, and back some decades ago, but we really don't know exactly where it was. We do know, however, that people died and buried in Lake George itself, and you heard from Gian Denuzzo about the 44 individuals who were disinterred because of a foundation being dug in Lake George and bones being found. Those 44 individuals are now being reinterred where the Fort George Hospital probably was, which is a marvelous, marvelous idea. Well, you've heard about the story of the Canadian expedition, the massive numbers of smallpox victims, in part because of wild smallpox coming in, and then in part because of the variolation that the troops began to practice illicitly and against the orders of their superiors. And so I won't go through any of that. But when they finally decided at Crown Point and through the Continental Congress and so on that they had to put up a hospital at Fort George, it was extremely hastily constructed and probably extremely poorly constructed. We think that there may have been 2 long log houses capable of housing about 350 men. And there was no foundation. There were floorboards, wind passing under the floorboards, of course. There weren't beds. You know, what people did was they were laid on the floor on blankets. Maybe they had a pillow, maybe they had a towel or a rag or something put up over a pair of boots or something for a pillow. You can imagine how minimal it was, and then how packed it became. A couple of quotes from 2 of the physicians, 2 of the probably 5 physicians who attended at various times during the summer of 1776. From Dr. Beebe, whose quote says, "The sick were crowded into a dirty, lousy, stinking hospital, enough to kill a well man." And Dr. Jonathan Potts, "The distressed situation of the sick, without clothing, without bedding, or a shelter sufficient to screen them from the weather, uppers of 1,000 sick and wounded in the sheds, laboring under the various disorders of dysentery, bilious, putrid fevers, and effects of confluent smallpox." By the way, it probably was all smallpox. You know, maybe there were a couple of non-smallpox infections, but I'm sure it was virtually all smallpox. Well, there was in toto probably something like 3,000 people who came through in that summer of 1776, and there was probably an extremely high mortality rate, now not 30%, but more like 50% or more. Briefly back to the disease to give you a sense. On day 1, the exposure day, you get it. There's then that incubation period where you don't know that you've got necessarily a disease, but it's proliferating inside of you. Then somewhere between day 9 and day 20, let's say 12 to 14, you begin to be symptomatic. The systemic symptoms, which are fever, intense backache, and generalized myalgias or muscle aches, terrible headache, that sort of thing. And it could be anything, but smallpox's symptoms were especially powerful. It wasn't until the rash broke out a couple of days later that it was clearly diagnosable as smallpox. The rash, as I mentioned, begins actually in the mouth and pharynx, and it makes things incredibly difficult to swallow, to eat, to drink. The tongue swells. People had a hard time talking, but they sure moaned a lot, you can imagine. When the rash starts to erupt, it becomes clear that it's smallpox, and you can see in this slide the progression of the disease in this one child. And you know, when it gets bad and it's now white, because those are pustules now, pus has formed into what had previously been clear fluid in the vesicles. You notice the extraordinary amount on the face and on the extremities, more so than on the body, curiously. That's called centrifugal rash, and that's characteristic of smallpox. When that happens and the pustules start to break down, there comes to be a terrible smell that was characteristic of smallpox. It was called smallpox fetor, F-E-T-O-R, and characteristic of the disease, it is said. Happily, I've never smelled it, so I can't really testify to that. And of course, recovery or death. It's really hard to imagine the suffering of the individuals who were laying out on those board floors. You know, cheek by jowl, very little care, very little medication, couldn't be cleaned because, you know, you try to wipe a person with rash like that, it's going to cause them to scream. It's going to be so painful. It's hard to imagine, but I want you to try because I think it's very important. Now let's look briefly at the ramifications of all this. Well, talk about casualties, and I won't go into this in any detail. We think that during the entire revolution, and this seems a total underestimate to me, there were 6,800 Americans killed by weapons and an additional 6,000 wounded, maybe 17,000 deaths by infections. So you see, it really wasn't the musket balls of the Brits. It was infection. And that became a lesson that George Washington and then the Continental Congress began to learn. Before the winter of 1778, when in Valley Forge, the second year began of variolation of the troops, it is estimated that before that, 90% of the deaths of soldiers were caused by infectious diseases. But then Washington's decision changed all that. Well, I won't extol General George Washington too much, except to say that he was a great leader of men, and he learned by his mistakes, and he never gave up. That's him in the winter of 1776-77 at Morristown, which is where he made the decision in early 77. In January 28, he wrote in a letter that inoculation, meaning the variolation procedure, can never be safely done. We should check, not spread the infection, that is quarantine. February 5, he starts a letter to Hancock and Gates opposing inoculation, and the next day he changes it. He changes his mind. And so he then writes, "No other precaution can prevent it from running through our whole army. I have determined the troops should be inoculated." So there it was, the first public health mandate. By the end of 1777, 40,000 soldiers had been variolated. More were than variolated in Valley Forge. And many historians consider this decision to be the most important decision that Washington made, and they mark it as a turning point in the Revolution, for these reasons. Number one, it prevented the explosive epidemics in the ranks of the colonial troops. Number two, the recruits who really had in their hearts the desire to fight, but were scared to do so because they were farm boys who had never been exposed to smallpox, now knew that the troops were variolated and that they would be much, much less likely to have smallpox should they join the Continental Army. So they joined. All right, brief summary. We've learned that smallpox may have been the worst malady to affect human beings. It almost exterminated the Native Americans. It almost defeated us in the Revolution, and it has become the only disease that we have fully eradicated. We've just heard about George Washington's greatest decision. But let's go back briefly to the Continental Army, the agonies that they suffered of starvation and exposure to, cold and it's amazing to try and put yourself in their positions. Why did they do that is a big question. They did win in the end, but they won because they never gave up. And that was basically George Washington's leadership that provided that. Here is the face, the reconstructed face of one of the disinterred victims of smallpox that was found in Lake George Village. And it helps us understand that these were real people that suffered and died in the cause of defending, or of making our democracy. And, trying to understand why they had the chutzpah, the bravery, the courage to do what they did is very worthwhile to try and do. But what's really more important is that we, all of us in this room, all of us in America, think about what they suffered and died for. And I think what I'm trying to say here is that thinking about their sacrifices, their agonies, helps us think about what are of value to us and what we're willing to suffer, perhaps to die for. I will briefly mention this treasure. If you haven't been to Fort Ty to see this knapsack, by all means do. It's the only knapsack that exists which accompanied an individual through the campaign up into Canada, back down. This man was not infected with smallpox. I don't know whether or not he had had previously smallpox or variolation. He fought then in New York and in New Jersey later on, carried that backpack, that knapsack with him the whole way, and when he left it to his children, the last sentence there is, "And whilst one shred of it," meaning the knapsack, "shall remain, never surrender your liberties to a foreign invader or an aspiring demagogue." Benjamin Warner. This is our foundational idea, folks. It was a group of upstart legislators on the edges of a great continent. They were real people who declared that no man was born better than any other.
Thank you, Michael Gabriel, Sam Huntington, Richard Leach. Thank you so much. This is incredible.